Welcome to the Best Books Podcast, a podcast from Orchard Hill Church that allows you to choose your next book. I'm your host, Jonathan Thiede. And to begin today, I want to give you sort of a promotional thing that we're doing. If you're watching this on YouTube or if you're listening through a podcast app, we actually have a form that you can respond with a book that's been impactful to you. We want to give you opportunity to sort of raise your hand and say, hey, this is a book that's been impactful to me. But just know that if you fill it out, I might ask you to come on here and talk about it. So with that said, my guest today is a worship leader and someone who is passionate about having a reasonable faith. Please welcome to the show for episode 13, Dan Shields. Dan, how's it going?
Good, Jonathan. How are you doing today?
Doing well. Thanks so much for coming on.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Why don't you start off just by telling us a little about yourself, your family, and how you got to Orchard Hill?
Oh, yeah. So I was at Orchard Hill solidly in the 20th century. So I came from the last millennia.
Yeah.
So I got here, I think it was 98, something like that. So it was not long after they moved into this new building from the little chapel.
Yeah.
And
That's a claim to fame around here.
It is, I actually played at the chapel. So it existed, when I was first here. It's now, since gone. But I was a guitar player, and I would, come in and play the services as a guitar player, and then I got hired on staff. And
so you're here as a volunteer?
I was paid. So,
okay. Gotcha.
I was here as a paid musician. No, it's good. But anyhow, since then, we took a trip to Germany back in the early 2000s, and that's where I met my wife. She's from Croatia, but she was studying in Germany at the time, and so I have 3 kids, 1 in college, and a dog named Nala, who we all love, and we just adopted a feral cat, so I got that going on too.
Yeah, awesome. Well, it's a joy to have you on today.
Thanks.
I think a lot of people see you up leading worship, and they know that that's your role. So why don't you tell us something that you enjoy about your role, and maybe a challenge that you face as a director of worship?
Yeah. So what I enjoy, first of all, I love the people. So we have a wonderful team of people. So I really enjoy just being with them, not even just making music, but being with the folks on the team. It's a really good team. Sometimes in churches, worship teams, they can be challenging,
Sure.
But we've just had a wonderful team of servants who they really understand what worship's all about, and that it's not about them, but it's really about serving the Lord. So that's always a joy, and they're just great people too. But the thing I think I like most about my job is basically anytime I have my guitar around my neck, that's the best part of my day in general. So that's
awesome.
what I like. Things that are challenges, sometimes scheduling can be challenges or difficult, but in general, it's just, the busy work of the job I don't always love, but everything else is great. You know?
So would you say, I think it's common even in something as enjoyable as music, once it sort of becomes a part of your job, it's sort of less enjoyable. So would you say that hasn't really been your case?
Nope.
Awesome.
So I'm the dude that works at the pizza shop and still loves the pizza.
Yeah.
So,
nice.
I still before I came here this morning, I was practicing my guitar. So I was sitting in my living room playing, and it's something that I love to do, I'm passionate about, and still enjoy. And it's one of those things. It's funny, the further you go in a field, the more you recognize, I think, how little you know about the field. And, so the higher level of expertise you have, the more you have an understanding that it's almost infinite what you can learn and what the possibilities are, so that's always enjoyable for me. I'm breaking through on some brand new stuff that I've never learned before, and that's always a joy for me to do,
Yeah, totally. Well, from my perspective, not to give my family a shout out, but my wife started serving in worship, and so I feel like I've gotten sort of a behind the scenes look at what it looks like to serve. And I just think from my perspective, the little interaction I get is basically like 15 minutes before a lot of the worship center, the lobby volunteers get there. There's that period where you get to talk to people serving on tech, people serving in worship, and I'm just always struck that I think, based on my experience at other churches, you're right. Like with worship volunteers, it's easy for everyone to sort of pull in their own direction. And so I think what you've done is well, and I can sort of sense it, is that you give people the direction. You're saying, okay, in order to be a part of this, we're going to move in this direction. And I think that's just good for everyone involved. I think it just is helpful to sort of have that leadership.
Yeah, and what a lot of people don't know too is, you see people come up and, they play their half-hour set.
Yeah.
But when somebody volunteers on that team, it's about a dozen hours. So, they practice at home for a couple of hours. They put, 2, 3, 4 hours in. Some of the guys, recent guys that have been on the team, they would say, like, I've practiced 8 hours for this song. So just to give and then we have our, rehearsal and then 3 services. So yeah, it's, the minimum sort of a dozen hours if somebody steps up on stage. So if you're out there and you see people on the team, thank them for how much they've served and how well they've done for us. They're really a blessing,
Yeah, totally. What do you enjoy doing in your downtime when you're not at the church?
Yeah, so music is still a big part of my passions. I love to like hike and stuff like that. I love the outdoors. That's what probably brings me, gives me life and joy. I'm definitely an introvert, so I like quiet or deeper conversation. I'm not like a big party group type of guy. So I think that, and being with my family, I really love to be with my family.
Yeah.
But I always feel like I'm one of these guys that's always busy doing something. So I'm always at something.
Yeah.
I don't necessarily love that about me, but it is who I, even on vacation, like I need to achieve something and do something and conquer something or whatever,
Yeah, totally. Well, one more kind of sillier question before we dive into our topic today.
Yeah.
I played basketball last night and I severely jammed my thumb. And even in the past 12 hours, I'm seeing how many situations where you need all your fingers.
Yeah.
So my question to you is, out of your 10 fingers, if you could choose one that you can't use for the rest of your life, which one would it be?
Oh yeah, absolutely. It would be this guy here that I have so I put my wedding ring on, and I put it on that finger specifically because if I lost this finger, like if something would grab it and I would lose my finger, that would be a problem. But if I lost this finger, I could survive and still do all right.
Yeah, totally. Wait, why would that? Oh, just because you're...
It's on my picking hand, so I don't really need it. But these guys here, I actually really do need them.
Sure. That would severely impair you. Yeah. I would say similarly. I would say one of my ring fingers, just because I feel like the ring finger, as great as it is and symbolic for marriage, it's the usefulness, is not. It's more there for support, because you think pinky, but then there's a lot of situations where where you need that pinky finger. So, but anyway, that's not what we're here to talk about. Today we're here to talk about a book by Norman Geisler and Frank Turek, interestingly titled "I Don't Have Enough Faith to Be an Atheist." This book, right at the beginning, I think there's sort of an introduction before chapter 1. It talks about there wasn't a resource out there that was sort of like a one-stop shop for all sort of apologetic questions. And so really this is what this book claims to be. So before we get into it, what has been your journey with sort of the topic of apologetics?
Yeah, so it's a field that I've always been really kind of interested in. I think having a sound defense of the faith is something that's a biblical commandment. We need to be able to have a defense of the faith. I think, if we serve a God who, so if God is make-believe, if we've made him up and he's some make-believe God in the sky, it really doesn't matter what your belief is. If you just believe to believe. But if he really is the God of the universe who really did put things into place, he should be understandable in a logical way. And we should be able to convey that to other people in some ways. Now, at the end of the day, it's always faith and it's always a mystery. And it was almost like what I was talking about earlier with your craft. No matter what field you're in, you realize there's like an infinite depth of potential understanding and knowledge. And it's even beyond that when you deal with God, because he truly is infinite. You never get to the bottom of who he is and what he's done. But I think he is understandable, reasonable, logical, and he's put his fingerprints on a lot of things that we can see, and we should be able to really convey that to some people and give a reason for our faith. Paul, a lot of the Bereans, because they searched out the scripture to see if what he was saying was true, and we are to be able to give a reasonable defense for our faith.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, totally. So in that vein, considering how important it is, what's maybe a situation that you've experienced with maybe one of your kids or a volunteer or someone who is sort of struggling in this area and maybe reminded you of the value of apologetics?
Yeah, so this is really recent, actually. my niece, who I deeply love, she lives here in Pittsburgh now. She was from Philly, and she's somebody who's really like, she's a seeker in a lot of ways. She's read a lot of stuff, especially from like the modern day atheists, you know, the Richard Dawkins and Christopher Hitchens and those guys. You know, they call them the four horsemen of the atheistic apocalypse. So she's read a lot of that stuff, and you know, obviously those are very intelligent guys who have some devastating arguments, some very difficult arguments, and if you don't know your faith very well, it can really shake you. Now, she's not a Christian, but she's open, and she's open in a way that she wants to see what's most reasonable and what makes the most sense. So, you know, when you first read those guys, like anybody who portrays any sort of argument, it seems logical and right and true until you see the flip side. And I think because, you know, they would often do debates against Christians, you know, she probably has seen some of those, and you know, sometimes those guys are just smarter. And you know, one thing that's important to remember is just because you lose an argument doesn't mean that you're not right. So somebody can be smarter than you. You know, you or I could go up against some of these guys, and they could tear us up. But it doesn't mean the veracity of Christianity is wrong. It just means that we don't know enough to be able to combat that. You know, the assertions against us. But I think she probably saw some, you know, like John Lennox's or people like that, or Frank Turek's, or people that have stood and, you know, debated with these guys and are very deep thinkers and are very serious and have very good answers and don't have any sort of, you know, light CCD, you know, kids ministry type of answers. But they really dig into some very substantial thought. And anyhow, I think she's seen some of that, and so we've had some discussions that have been really joyful for me. I mean, I've really enjoyed them a lot. But also, you know, you need to have some understanding, because people are coming at you with real facts and difficult things to challenge you. You know, like I'll give you an instance. I just watched something not too long ago that was one of these guys, and he started off. It was Hitchens. Was it? Or Dawkins, it was Dawkins, and it doesn't matter, but he said, you know, 99% of the species that have ever existed are extinct now. So your God was not a very good designer if you're saying that he designed all things. What do you say to that? You know, and that's like, ooh, man, that's, you know, to be put in the hot seat on something like that is very challenging if you don't have some good answers to be able to combat that with, you know.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, hopefully it's an encouragement to anyone listening, because I'm in full-time ministry, and I often have those moments where you just stumble upon a video on Instagram, you know, from an atheistic perspective, and it does sort of, you know, hit you. And
yeah, I'll glaze over. You're like, I have no idea what I would say in that situation. You know, and it's difficult.
Yeah, you kind of panic because you kind of put yourself in that person's shoes. But I mean, thank God we have people who are wired that way. And to your point, it's almost like an art in and of itself, just that type of debate and argumentation. It takes a certain kind of person who can think on the fly, who can take everything that they've learned up to that point, synthesize it in the moment, and then offer a good example or a good insight. Doug Wilson is someone who does.
Just to interrupt you, like
go for it.
you know, like I was talking about this morning. You know, I'm working through in my field certain like very difficult chord changes. But you know, I've worked on these certain things, so now I can hear them and I can respond to them very, very quickly. Well, those guys too, you know, they spend a lot of their life and a lot of their waking hours going through some of the arguments of the great atheists, and they have quick answers for these things. Oftentimes, there's normally in their world there's not a ton of surprises. You know, Dawkins is not going to drop a bomb on them, but they're like, man, I've never heard that argument before, and vice versa, which is interesting. You know, those guys have. The atheists have to wrestle with, you know, some of the really intense arguments that we as Christians have as well, you know.
Yeah, and so how these things go is there's often like a debate, and I've heard that their goal isn't really to win over the person they're debating against, but it's more of the audience is sort of the, or if you're watching a video, you are sort of the target audience. So.
Well, it's the elections, and it's the undecided voters that you're going for, because that's going to win the election. You know, and that's I think in the debates, that's exactly what they're going after, the undecided. You know.
Yeah, that's a good comparison. So why don't you tell us what you know about Norman Geisler? He's someone whose name I recognize, but I'm not really sure why I recognize it. Do you know? Is he sort of has he planted himself in this sort of apologetic landscape?
Absolutely. So he's one of the voices, and he was famous especially for, he was a guy who was a really great apologist to the cults. And just to define what I mean by the cults, they're organizations that look as if they're Christian organizations that would say that they believe in Jesus, but they've gone outside of the pale of orthodoxy, outside of that center circle of some core belief. So the Mormons and Jehovah's Witness and the Watchtower people would, people who might deny the deity of Christ, for instance. That's a big deal. If you're a Christian and you say Jesus really wasn't God, that's a pretty serious issue. So he was a pretty sharp guy with that, but he's also a guy who's debated a lot with science. He's written systematic theology books. He's a professor. One of his guys that has really studied him a lot is a guy named Hank Hanegraaff, who you might know as the Bible Answer Man, who had a popular radio program in like the 2000s. And he was one of these guys that would do, the Glenn Beck show for Christians type of thing. But you call in with your difficult, how could the Trinity be? There's three gods. Explain to me your reasoning why it's the Trinity. And he would go through and answer these very, very difficult questions. But he was one of Geisler was his mentor in many ways. So,
yeah, totally. One person who I feel like has been a voice, at least for, I guess, my generation and younger, is a guy named Mike Winger. Have you come across him at all?
I just listened to him yesterday.
Okay, great. Yeah, he's a great sort of Instagram follow, because he takes sort of the sound bites and then he responds to them in sort of a 60-second sort of format. And so he's someone who, like I was referencing earlier, you come across an argument and you're like, I don't know what I would say. And then thankfully there's someone like Mike Winger who has thought about it and has taken more than 30 seconds to really think about it. But when you're scrolling, it looks more impressive than it is. It's like, oh man, he just had this idea right away. But,
well, it's funny. Somebody on our team who was a female worship leader asked challenging questions. She said, there's that scripture that women should be silent in church, and that is a caustic scripture that it's inflammatory. People are like, what does that mean? And they get really upset about that. And there's some different interpretations on it. But she said, is it reasonable for us as worship leaders, female worship leaders, to speak on stage, or is that tipping that line of being a teacher and doing something that's unbiblical? It's a very good question, insightful question. And it just so happened that I was looking at a Mike Winger thing, and he was talking about that very thing, but he did like a year of research in the video that I was looking at yesterday. It wasn't a 60-second, it was 11 hours of video on this one question. Wow. And I was like, I don't know if I can watch 11 hours on it, but that's a lot of research,
Yeah, totally. Yeah, so the long and short of it is these people we're grateful that they have faith and they have reasons behind their faith, and that we have them as resources. And one of those resources today that we're talking about, I Don't Have Enough Faith to Be an Atheist, by Norman Geisler and Frank Turek. It's based on the seminar that I believe Geisler used to do, called The 12 Points That Show Christianity is True. And so he has three main parts of the book. It's like I said, it's 12 points, and so he begins dealing with just truth in general. How can we know anything is true? And then he moves to a theistic God. So the God of the Bible, but more so any sort of God, any sort of deity. And then he zeroes in on Christianity specifically. And when I read it, I thought he did a really good job giving a lot of space to arguments for God's existence, things that I'd heard before: the cosmological argument, teleological argument, moral arguments. But I thought that it was especially helpful, specifically as they talked about these arguments for God's existence, especially as it relates to thermodynamics. I don't know if you remember anything about that section, but my dad is actually a professor of physics and engineering, and so he teaches a class that's just all about thermodynamics. So I was texting him while I was reading this book, and I was like, this is really fascinating.
Yeah, for sure.
So I think these sort of scientific arguments in general, it doesn't have to be thermodynamics, are really interesting. And one of the reasons I was excited to talk to you about this is because I think you're someone who, you really enjoy talking about apologetics. You enjoy talking about these things. I honestly don't. It's not really something that's ever come naturally to me. I get
not in your wheelhouse.
Yeah, I get overwhelmed. My sort of fight or flight starts going off. I'm not good at sort of living in that tension of like we disagree about something fundamental. I'm like,
Yeah.
we got to resolve this as soon as possible, you know. And so, but I say that to say if someone like me can get a lot out of it, and there's parts of my brain that are firing as I'm reading this and really enjoying it, I think that says a lot about just the way that they've written the book and the way that it's accessible really to anyone. Dan, as you recall the book, did any chapters or topics stick out to you especially?
Well, I don't know. You know, I mean, so the big three arguments for the existence of God, those have been around for a very long time that you just outlined, but those are pretty intense arguments. There's a lot to them. You know, one thing, just to reel back to something you said, you were talking about thermodynamics, and you know some of the challenges that the atheists would bring up with that. But you know, the laws of thermodynamics. When you look at Newton was somebody who was, in a way, trying to not prove the existence of God. He was just doing science, but he believed that because God was a logical God of logical order, that there would be logical laws that he put in place that we could find. And because of that, in many ways, the scientific method was born. So, you know, when people talk about like the debate between science and Christianity, I think you have to be really careful with, you want to parse what are they saying when they say that? Because it's, you know, the scientific method itself was born out of Christian thought. So you want to ask the question, like, what are you talking about? And most people say, like, oh, well, it's the debate of, you know, the origin of the species or something like that, you know. But, you know, boy, there's so much to this that you could go so many different angles. But one thing that I think is important, you know, when people will point fingers a lot of times at Christianity and say that Christianity has stood against science and that they've been a voice, you know, they were sort of the flat earthers of their day, you know, saying that we were, you know, that the Earth was the center of the universe, for instance. So you just take that example, you know, sort of from Ptolemy to Copernicus to Kepler or something like that. And they say, you know, like even in the days of Galileo, the church was standing against him and calling him a heretic because he said that, you know, we weren't the center of the universe and that everything didn't rotate around us. But you do have to realize a couple of things. First of all, Galileo was a Christian who deeply believed in Jesus. That's an important distinction. So the church is going after this guy, but this guy's not a secular humanist. He's a Christian, just like Newton was a Christian or Kepler was a Christian. So that's an important thing to remember. And you also have to remember that most of the scientific community was part of the church. They were the literate few of the Dark Ages, you know, so the church really held the scientific community. So most of the time when you had somebody disagreeing, for instance, with Galileo, it wasn't some bishop somewhere. It was a guy who was a scientist who disagreed with that scientific theory. He might have used Bible because of it, but that's an important distinction to remember, that most of the time it was scientists who were wrong disagreeing with scientists. And so you have to ask the question, if it's a church problem, does that happen today within the scientific community? So, you know, Einstein comes up with relativity. How was that received in the scientific community? Not all that well. You know, anytime scientists have their theories that they've lived with and taught for their entire lives, when a new theory comes, it's normally shot down by the scientists. So you have to remember that science disagrees with science and that old science disagrees with new science all the time. So when you point an accusing finger at the church, there's some legitimacy to it, but not as much as people give sway to, I'd say.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think when you get into these sort of discussions, you have to be able to parse what is a stereotype and what is a legitimate accusation. Because there's some things that I think atheists could say about Christianity that, okay, that's a legitimate
we gotta own,
critique.
Right?
Yeah,
you gotta own it. Yes.
That happened,
Yes.
especially things that revolve around sort of controversy. But I think you have to also be able to parse, hey, this is a stereotype. This really doesn't hold water. And to your point, when you're engaged in a conversation like this, just the more that you can sort of define terms, okay, what do you mean by that? I think that's going to lead to a much more rich conversation. And to that point, I think you have to understand when someone is in these contexts, both parties can be guilty of sort of just wanting to
get like a sound bite or dunk on someone.
Right,
you don't have to be recorded in order for that to be true. You can just it's just human nature to want to win an argument. And so as a Christian and as people trying to be winsome for Christ, we have to realize, okay, is this getting anywhere, right? Or are we sort of just becoming more entrenched? Am I getting more angry? Am I, getting more and more worked up about this?
That's an important point, I think, when you're talking one-on-one with somebody. A debate, public debate is a different thing, but in one-on-one, I'd say in very, very few instances do you win somebody for Christ by winning an argument against them. Somehow you've got to connect with people and let them know that there is a God who loves them and cares for them. You're not going to win just by simply like squashing their ideas and showing them how foolish they are. Nobody gets won to Christ by that in general, I think.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. So sadly, we're quickly running out of time, but a big part of this podcast is we like to sort of transition at the end to thinking about Orchard Hill, thinking about people that this book could be beneficial for. So when you think about someone who would enjoy this book, someone who would benefit from this book, what kind of person do you have in mind?
Well, first of all, anybody who has a degree of skepticism about them, and I think skepticism is really healthy. If you don't have, in some ways, a skeptical faith, you don't have a sincere and honest and thoughtful faith oftentimes. And that's not to say somebody can't just, kind of blindly believe in Christianity and, God's okay with that. But I think in general, you want to be thoughtful in what your faith really is, because there is real truth behind our faith. So, having some levels of understanding is important. I'd say in our congregation, we have a very thoughtful congregation in general. So a lot of people are highly educated. They're in circles where other people who might be skeptical have some serious arguments against Christianity and serious thoughts against Christianity. So to be able to have some really good, elevator conversation, soundbite type of, like for instance, somebody might say, well, the Big Bang, is what made all of this happen. And just to be able to say, so, Hawkins went all the way back to that nanosecond after that, pinpoint of whatever it was, burst into, the Big Bang. But a nanosecond before, what was there? And where did it come from? Or go to the edge of the universe. What's beyond that? So you can take either extreme. To be able to ask those sort of probing questions and say, like, something can't come from nothing. So where did it come from? What was the dynamic that made that happen? And that really does go beyond science and into theology, I think. Not that science doesn't have some voices in that, but it really gets into a bigger picture. And it sort of changes the conversation in a really positive twist where people are all of a sudden thinking about God and who He is. So I think anybody who wants to be able to witness to somebody who might have some skepticism, this would be a great book for also.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for that. It's, I think it's a reminder to me of just the beauty of how God has created the church. We're not just sort of carbon copies of one another. Some of us are more passionate about these sort of subjects, and others maybe not so. But I would just say to people like me who sort of bristle against these sort of arguments, maybe don't have much of an interest in science, didn't do well in science in school, I would highly recommend this book just because it is what they set out to be. It's a one-stop shop. If you've ever had questions about your faith and you don't really know what book to pick up, I would highly recommend this as a starting point. And they do a good job of sprinkling in other resources that are helpful as well. But Dan, I go back to that a volunteer you were talking about, and I think those are the kind of people that we really want to make sure those interactions are positive and beneficial. And what I mean by that is it's easy for us to be sensitive as Christians, and so anytime someone pushes back and says, well, what about this? Have you ever thought about this? It's really easy to be on the defensive and jump to conclusions and think, oh man, you're against us, But often what they're doing there is they want to be more with you, and they want to know what you have to say about that topic, and the way that we, I think, interact with those people is really helpful. And so I think about in the young adult community that I lead, there are a lot of people that are honestly just, no matter what we did, they'd be okay. They're along for the ride. But the people that raise their voices and say, well, why do we do it this way? Those are the people I'm always like, have you ever thought about being a leader? Because it's that line of thinking that is going to bring us forward and going to sort of help us make progress. So Dan, I really appreciate you coming on. I think this is a topic that's important for not only Orchard Hill people to understand, but really all Christians to understand. We really hope you enjoyed our conversation. If you like this episode, be sure to share it with someone that you think would enjoy it. This really helps people become aware of this podcast and Orchard Hill Plus in general, and invites them into these kinds of conversations that we're having. Like I said at the beginning of the episode, we have a suggested book, a promotional down at the bottom of the page if you're on YouTube. If you're listening on the podcast platform, look for it in the show notes. You can use this to suggest books for the future, or just to give us feedback on what you like about this podcast and what you'd like to see more of. Please join us next time when we talk to Lindsay Brasher about the book Habits of the Household, a book on Christian parenting. Until then, see you next time.